So at the DHI, we really are like the hub for the arts and humanities on campus, and we offer lots of different services and grant opportunities, and we share a lot of events that happen on campus. So if you are newer to campus or if you've never heard of the DHI, please check us out at our website. Another thing you can do is sign up for our newsletter. So we have wonderful grad student researchers who work with the DHI every quarter, and they put a lot of work into writing like really lovely stories about things that happen on campus or review events or talk about upcoming things of interest to our campus community in the arts and humanities. And then they also package events, funding opportunities, stories, things that you can kind of look and review to get a better picture of what's happening here on campus. And that goes out every week. Newsletter is called This Week in the Humanities. So you can sign up for that newsletter and learn about some of our upcoming programs or just kind of find out more about what's happening in our community and on our campus around the arts and humanities broadly. The website itself also offers a lot of resources around the programs we offer, including the PhD Unlimited series, which this event is a part. I wanted to say just a little bit in the corner there around Podcast University, which is something that the DHI is now launching, which is a kind of deeper exploration of different storytelling projects using podcasting on the UC Davis campus and starting to profile graduate students, faculty, staff, just people who are using podcasting as a medium for sharing more about the work they do or the stories that they tell using the methods of the arts and humanities. So keep an eye out for more of those to come. But you are all here today because the series that this is PhD Unlimited, and it was started in 2014 as a way to really think broadly about career preparation, I mean, in the broadest sense, for our humanities PhD students. And so the kinds of events that happen in this series can be things directly related to like working on your CV or applying for academic jobs or, getting grants. But we've also included things like how might you be interested in doing publicly engaged research? Is that something you can bring to your work? Or how do you tell your story about being in graduate school to employers beyond the university? And so sometimes we lead those workshops in-house, other times we invite in kind of experts from our campus and community. And that's an example of what we're doing here today is we're offering these two events on podcasting humanities, the first of which will take place now and feature some kind of reporting and sharing about grad students who've been a part of a podcasting workshop. And that will be followed in February with a hands-on workshop for people who are interested in like practically how do you get started? What does the equipment look like? And the DHI has just created a new podcasting lab in Voorhees Hall. It's soundproofed, it has beautiful new equipment, and it's totally available for your all use. And that's where the February workshop will take place, in person. Hopefully we can all be there and start to familiarize ourselves with the equipment and think about how you might practically get started with next steps. So save the date for that one. But today we're here because the National Humanities Center, which, kind of in its name, is a national network of humanities learning and research and kind of sharing opportunities, hosts a virtual graduate podcasting workshop every year. They also host one for faculty. So if you are a faculty member and you're interested in that, know that there's also a space for you to learn how to do this through the NHC. But the Davis Humanities Institute sponsors, pays the registration costs for our graduate students to attend this virtual workshop. And it's really a focus on how do you think about podcasting, how do you think about storytelling, and for audiences beyond the university itself. And that's where I'm going to hand off today's presentation because we are really thrilled to have 4 people who were a part of the cohort of this year's workshop, which only ended, 10 days ago. It was the 11th through the 15th. So they really are like still maybe processing that experience, but now they're going to share back about what they learned. But we are joined also by Beshara Kehdi, who's in cultural studies and attended the workshop last year, but has really a range of experience with podcasting on campus. And so we are grateful that he's here to wrap up the presentations before we have some question and answers. So if you have questions, save those for the end. We will love to hear them, and I'm sure that folks would be happy to answer the questions that you have. So we're going to go in order of the screen, which means that I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Daniel, who is in history and will kind of kick us off with their experiences as part of the Podcasting Institute.
Hi,
Thanks,
everyone.
Daniel.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Castaneda. I'm a third year in the history department, and I had a really great experience in the Podcasting Institute. At first, I was a little bit intimidated because they sent us out a schedule, and it was like 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day. And I don't wake up till like 9:30. So I was like, what is going to happen? How is this going to go? But it was a really great opportunity because I think initially what I thought was going to happen is I thought we were going to like individually work on a podcast of our own like making or idea. But it was really much more collaborative, which was really good because there's just simply like I'll kind of share after like what my takeaways are. But one of the things that I realized is like it's probably better to not go it alone in this kind of setting for some people, and myself included. And I realized just how much goes into making a podcast. But what's really nice about the Institute is, they give you all the equipment. You don't really have much prep before you go into it. But like at the beginning of the week, I didn't know what I was doing, but by the end, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I'm actually decently proficient in how to like do audio editing and coming up with ideas and generating, a podcast from beginning to end. And I think what was useful was in the group in my group, we had an English student, somebody from the Spanish and Portuguese department, and I believe one person from comparative literature. So when we were coming up with ideas, it was like, well, we all kind of want to like do something on our research. And so we were thinking about like ways that things overlapped. But then we realized like that's going to take too much time, like too much extra research to try to put together a podcast in 1 week. So what we ended up doing was we created a podcast that was focused, it was called Root U, and it was all about our experiences as graduate students. So like moments in graduate school or academia where we felt kind of excluded, and then moments where we felt included or reaffirmed in what we were doing. And so that was really nice because I think we came up with a great podcast, and it was an opportunity to sort of think about our skills in a way that we probably wouldn't have. Like I'm sure we all would have come in with a subject matter podcast that would have been fantastic, but it was nice to sort of work with the group and see like how you can collaborate and develop new relationships. And so that was one of the things that I really liked. One of my big takeaways from the program was that I realized that I probably can't do a podcast anytime soon. And part of that is because I'm in exams and trying to get my dissertation prospectus approved. So right now it's just like too much time, but like, I think it's a good takeaway from the Institute because now I kind of know like what the expectations are. And if I want to get involved in this, kind of what I need to do to create like a ready-made podcast. But one of the other things that I was thinking about is in the future, if I want to create a podcast. So one of the things that I came in with was that I'm really interested in, so my research is in political history. And I was like, oh, I want to talk about things that like I found in the archives, but I don't have time to write a paper on, or I don't have time to, do a really in-depth research project. But here's a way to kind of like bring in more people because we've all, as historians, a lot of us have all gone to the archive and found really cool things, but we have no use for them or they don't fit into a paper. But now I'm like, well, I could reach out to other people at different universities and like get them involved. So like if I have a really busy time period, I can sort of work with other people and not to like pawn off work, right? But to like think more collaboratively in a way that I wouldn't have before doing this experience, because I was very much like, oh, if I'm going to do this, I got to do it myself and like do all the producing and stuff. So yeah, I think that was a really useful takeaway. And then one of the other things I think for me is just thinking about how I can use these skills beyond just for myself. So I work for the California History Social Science Project, which is an office. It's on campus, but not really of the campus. So like it's created by the state legislature, and we work with K through 12 educators to kind of like help them teach history better or social science. And so one of the things that I've sort of thought is we've been talking about like, can we do podcasting as the history project? And now I can sort of say like, oh, I can contribute to this conversation. So like, even though like I sort of went into this thinking like, here's my individual opportunity to like learn how to podcast, I've now been able to sort of think like, oh, I can use this as like in a job. Or like if I apply for things after, obviously we all, or not we all, but many of us want to do like a tenure track position. But if you can't, here's an opportunity for like transferable skills. And I think that, a lot of companies and a lot of agencies are thinking about podcasting. So now I have skills that I can sort of transfer somewhere else. And if not, I can create hopefully a cool podcast and it'll be great. But I think that going to this institute really showed me what I didn't know and, new opportunities for developing relationships and collaborative opportunities in the future. So I'm not going to monopolize time, but if you have questions for me after, I'm happy to answer them. But I think we'll go ahead and pass it on next to Ben.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ben. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Comparative Lit department. I kind of study Chinese language and English language film. And all that means is I didn't have much experience in podcasting before this wonderful opportunity. I had listened to like Boston sports podcasts and like This American Life and some true crime, but I wouldn't have identified as someone who like knows podcasts or kind of was a podcast junkie. And so that was before this kind of week-long institute. And so one of the reasons why I mentioned that is I think this institute was a really great opportunity, and it was like a really special opportunity for someone who isn't familiar with podcasts and who wants to try something new to kind of go out and get some new skills and try something for like a whole week, and to like kind of immerse oneself in a whole new program for a week. I think that the program itself is kind of designed for people with a lot of different proficiencies and a lot of different skill levels, and it was a relatively stress-free environment, so I would encourage everyone to kind of apply. The program itself was kind of a mix of seminars, discussions, and group work. So my group was me and Carly from UC Davis, and then two other people from Arizona, and we did a podcast called Foodscapes, and it was kind of, I think as you'll hear from other people, food was like a very popular point of discussion for a lot of groups. I think it was like a very easy and accessible and kind of like unifying point for all of us. And I will say that podcasting, it's a really great medium for engagement. I've done some work doing interviews and writing articles and features about people, and I think podcasting kind of overlaps with those techniques and skills. It's a great medium to kind of learn and to kind of step outside of, you know, like the writing papers that usually have like very strict parameters and registers and like giving lectures. So I think that was like a really great opportunity just to like use a different part of my mind that I don't usually get to use outside of being a PhD student. So our podcast was kind of centered on the question about like what was food to you, and we structured the podcast kind of like a dinner party. So we wrote kind of like a rough outline and script where we went around and talked about like different meanings of food. So like I talked about like my grandpa, who is a chef, and his like interactions and relationships with my mom when she married into the family. Someone else talked about like doing graduate work in America and learning how to cook with like all these new ingredients and cuisines. Someone else talked about like what food meant to them in the context of being a new mother, and like how being a mom overlaps with their research on like indigenous knowledge systems. And then someone else talked about like food scarcity growing up. So like it was very a lot of different perspectives coming into this kind of podcast, and I was like the main editor. And so when I was editing, I was working with like the Audacity, which is like a file system. And apart from using Audacity for my language classes when I'm like recording like oral tests, I hadn't used Audacity before. So like within 3 days, I was kind of pulling up sound files and editing everything and like inserting music, sound effects. So it was quite a lot. And so, you know, I would add like cafe background music and cut out all my like ums and likes, which I have a habit of adding. And so I think the most interesting part of editing was how natural you can make conversation. Like, to be honest, when we were having our interviews and conversation, the recording was like a huge mess. We had like a baby crying in the background. We were new to each other, so we were kind of trying to capture response dialogue where someone says like, "Oh, that sounds great," but there was just a lot of cutting over because we were like unfamiliar with each other, and there was just like so much apologizing. But with editing, you're able to like cut that out, and you're able to kind of make it flow really naturally into like a really good conversation. So right now, like my future podcasting plans kind of overlap with a current project I have, which is like working with Chinese cookbooks and book history. And I kind of want to turn that into like a podcast series. And there's another kind of project that me and some of the other language PhD students in Sproul were kind of like talking about. I wanted to call it Sproul Sprouts, but that's not, they shot that down immediately. So that's a placeholder title. But what we do want to do is talk about how us PhD language students are kind of experiencing research and talking about grad school. So that was kind of my experience, and I'll pass it on to Angel.
Hi everyone, my name's Angel. Oh my God, I need a clap for Ben. I feel like I want to like clapping after all the people. But my name's Angel Trazo. I'm a second year PhD student in the Cultural Studies program. And I had such a fun time with the podcasting experience. I was like, dang, I forgot that the quarter system started so early, right? So like classes started, like as a second year, I have hella classes. And I was like, I don't know how I'm gonna balance classes with this podcasting institute, but it ended up turning out great because they do record a lot of the sessions. And sometimes I'd be, trying to run errands while also having the Zoom on my phone. It was kind of chaotic, but it was such a great experience. And I just wanted to kind of share how just fun it was to meet all of these new people who I wouldn't have met otherwise. And prior to doing the Podcasting Institute, I also did NHC's the Teaching of the Humanities Institute. And in that group, we did like a collaborative syllabus, and I had so much fun just meeting folks, mostly from the East Coast for that program, that I was like, ooh, I really want to do this podcasting one. And for the podcasting one, they match you with people from your time zone. And I ended up with all UC people. So someone from Irvine, Riverside, and Santa Cruz. And I'm just going to share my screen really quick if my computer that's super old lets me, just to share the little artwork that we did. So we called our podcast UC and T. And our intro was welcome everyone to UC and T, where we spill the tea on our life as UC students and share our stories, our voices, the realness behind the scholarship. And since we were all from UCs, and funnily all from different years, like I was a second year and we had a first year, third year, and a fourth year, we decided to kind of talk through similar kind of like to the Roots podcast that Daniel was talking about, our grad school experiences, like specifically in the UC, and also learning about the stories that led us to our research, because we all ended up realizing that our research comes from a very personal place, like as someone who's in cultural studies and more so within the realm of Asian American studies, and I study Asian American youth culture. I love just talking about that. And then it seemed like the people in my podcasting group, we had Ogle, who's a Turkish international student and does research on Turkey. We had Annie, who is an English PhD student who is researching about women who are domestic workers because her mom's a domestic worker. And we had Umberto, who was talking about his experiences with policing as a Latino, as a man of color. And so those, it was just so fun, like getting to know each other by talking about our research interests in this podcast institute. And the way we did our podcast is we had a really rough Google Doc of like, here, we'll introduce ourselves and then we'll talk about our research interests. And we only have these two hours where we can all be together live. So we're just gonna record it all live. And it was so bad. Like at first we were just so awkward and we had to like yell at each other, like, okay, now it's your turn to transition into the next question. And so a lot of that had to get edited out. But then like an hour through, obviously the podcast was only like 30 minutes, but like an hour through, we were just talking crap to each other. Like we figured out that one of the people in our podcast didn't like boba, and I love boba, and my research is about boba, like bubble tea. So we just ended up like cracking a lot of jokes. And even though like we recorded it on Zoom, it didn't have the best sound quality, and we didn't really want to, it ended up working out because we didn't want to cut out, the laughter. We didn't want to have it to be too NPR professional and kind of lose the spontaneity. So we were able to just kind of like use a single track actually, and just kind of keep in all of our dialogue. And so it ended up sounding like a lot more of a conversational, like very raw, not too edited podcast. But I think since we came in with the idea of wanting to share the podcast with our undergrads and be like, oh, this is kind of how we ended up in grad school. And if you're interested in grad school, maybe these are the stories that you could that may inspire you or may also turn you away from grad school, because we also talked about the COLA protests and all of the other struggles of being on Zoom that UC students have gone through. But in the end, we hope that even though this was just like, it felt for us like a very rushed project and like a low stakes project, like hopefully it'll still be a resource for folks in the future. And it was just such a fun experience. So if anyone's like thinking about it, if anyone's watching this recording in the future and is like, should I apply? Definitely apply, and you'll get cool microphones and make new friends. So yeah, and I'll pass it on to Emily.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I feel like I could repeat a lot of things that people have already said. I think the sort of fast pace of the institute, working with other people, the kind of excitement of collaborating with new people that you've like literally just met 2 days ago, things like that are all a benefit really of attending something like this. Um, so I could say all those things. I'll back up though and say that the reason I wanted to do this initially is that my research, my research is on Appalachia, and I study a lot of kind of folk music and other oral tradition, sort of cultural objects there. And so I was thinking that like, oh, with my research, I'll probably eventually need to interview people or kind of look at other sorts of archive objects, possibly record some recordings of people playing, because so much of that culture is, really between like players. It's kind of a living tradition. And so I was thinking that a lot of those skills are sort of related to podcasting, like what makes a good interview? How do you make an interview not awkward? How do you make it sound reasonable? And so I will say one thing that I gained from, trying to learn how to do this is not just what kinds of skills do podcasters have to do on a daily basis that'll help me then do my research better, like how do I have a Zoom interview and save the recordings or whatever. But also it kind of did make me rethink like, okay, if I am going to be doing this kind of research, if I am going to be interviewing like a generation of players that are kind of the last repository of certain kinds of styles or whatever, like what can I then do with that information once I have it, besides just sticking it in my dissertation that probably no one will read? And the answer is, this is a way, even if it's not a podcast, kind of thinking about how this information can be shared or can be made available for other people. So I found that like just really helpful, just kind of thinking about the relationship between your research and other kinds of projects. The other thing I'll say about this, other people have talked about like the kind of crash course in audio editing that you get, trying to make yourself use Audacity, which is a finicky program at best. And I will say the other thing that this taught me is like, you really don't have to be an expert in audio to give this a go. That's definitely been something that I was anxious about in the past. And we got there at the end of the week. I edited some things. And I'll say that this was actually built into the structure of the Institute. So the people who were teaching us audio editing were not like people with, 15 years of experience in like the music industry or anything like that. They were scholars who had taught themselves audio editing so they could do podcasts or do related projects. And so you're really learning like this person saying, I don't know everything, but here's the tricks I figured out. And so I think they demonstrated really well the extent to which you can make things that are useful, or you can learn what you need to do in order to kind of pursue the sorts of projects you're interested in. So I would say if you're interested, if you're thinking about it, it's definitely possible. It's not overwhelming. We managed it in a week, at least like pretty okay. And then two last comments. I think other people have already talked about the value of the sort of collaborative, kind of creative, having to come up with stuff in a day and then record it the next day, like that kind of process. And I really enjoyed that. It's nice to meet new people. It's nice to learn new things, and to just like have very strange conversations while recording yourselves. But I will say the other part of that I think is interesting is because you are talking to people entirely from different disciplines, maybe in different parts of the country, you do practice like communicating with people outside your field and making sort of connections between different kinds of content or different research ideas or different methodologies or like what people think is important. And so I think that process itself could sort of push you, or at least it pushed me a little bit, to think of things that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. If I had done sort of like, I also kind of thought like Daniel did, like maybe I'll just do my own, and like that's not how the institute works, but I think it was also probably for the best because I definitely tried some things I wouldn't have tried before. And then I think my last comment is whether it's something like attending a week-long institute or even just going to the like upcoming workshop that I know PhD Unlimited is putting on. I think it's really important if this is something that you're interested in to just make time for it. It's really easy, I think, especially as like, I'm not gonna say especially as graduate students because faculty, everyone has this problem, but like it's really easy to get overwhelmed by teaching and research and all the things that we sort of have to do to like put off things that we might consider as like side projects that might actually be really interesting. And so really what was valuable for me about this is it made me sit down and do the thing that I had kind of been curious about for a long time. And it was like, okay, you have to do it and other people are counting on you to do it. So do it. And that was great because I feel like I learned a lot. So if you can find something to make the time, if you can attend a workshop, if you can work with other people, I highly recommend that. I think that's all I have. Check.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, right on. That was, thanks for helping to, I feel like I have a really better idea of the program. So I appreciate that and getting a sense of what you all did together, and the emphasis on working collaboratively is really interesting and something for us to think about at the DHI actually as we expand our work around podcasting. So I'm very pleased to pass it on to Beshara right now, who will say a little bit more as someone who's been a year out from the experience at the Podcasting Institute, and also just to say a little bit more about the work that he does on campus before we have space for question and answer. So pass it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks everyone else who participated this year. This was really fun for me to sort of see that every year everyone is just thrown into this week-long institute and is completely jarred by the experience, but also like you learn a lot. And it really teaches you a lot about, how to collaborate, but also how to tell stories in an interesting way. Both like the storytelling itself, but then also trying to think differently about this new medium, this new thing of podcasting. So it's always, it's cool to hear how everyone sort of interprets this. So I did the NHC Institute in 2020, so it's been a little over a year. And I'm also currently working on my own podcast. I've been working on it for a really long time, almost since like before grad school. This is like 2017, but it's just been like a slow kind of moving project within everything else. And so I can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. But I'm going to share my screen. I have 5 slides that I wanted to sort of help guide my comments for the rest of this time. Can everyone see this? Okay. Podcasting. Okay, let me do the fancy slide. Okay. So just to give everyone like a scope of podcasting, like podcasting is huge. I mean, a lot of people don't realize how big podcasting is. That the majority of American households have listened to at least a podcast. There's over 2 million podcasts themselves, not episodes, just podcasts. And so there's even more episodes themselves. And the listeners of podcasts are very loyal listeners. So people who listen to podcasts, like they listen to like 7 shows a week. And it's also a new audience. So this is important that the majority of people who are listening to podcasts now just started within the last 3 years. And so if we're thinking in terms of the millions and millions of people that are listening, these are all mostly newer listeners. And so it's still kind of on the up. We're thinking of sort of podcasting as an arc towards like a grander audience. We're still like not there yet. It's still sort of on the up and up. And so this is actually a good time for people that are curious to sort of like wet your fingers in this stuff. It's also important to understand it's also a predominantly wealthy and affluent listener community where the majority of folks are both college educated and have like 75K. And so just being aware of that. And it's also predominantly white. And so in terms of access, in terms of who's making podcasts, in terms of distribution, in terms of how this is becoming a relevant sort of phenomena, it's important to keep in mind class, racial sort of breakdowns, that's also impacting who's listening, who we're going to be making podcasts for, and also how people are listening. You know, a lot of this is done in people's cars or at home on their phones. And so just sort of, I wanted to sort of start off in terms of scope wise, how this is playing out. Podcasts are everywhere. Everyone has either heard of a podcast, has thought of, maybe they don't know exactly what it is, but they're everywhere. And in higher ed, from my experience, like there's been a hesitancy or just a lack of kind of awareness of how big the phenomena is of podcasting. And so it's really important to like sort of recognize the cultural changes that are out there in society, that it is actually a large phenomenon. And it's important, especially sort of piggybacking on some of the comments people said earlier, especially when we're thinking of what counts as being research. This came up last year, sort of in our group when we were thinking about this, is that there has also been pushes for counting podcasts as a legitimate form of academic research, or something legitimized as academic work. That it's not just that you can write a paper, but how can we expand the category of sort of academic production that values this type of work as much as, you know, writing a paper for a journal. And so just keep that in mind as you're thinking of like what counts as the work that we do, what kind of work is valued, isn't valued, because podcasts and sort of this world, this new sort of growing world of podcasting in universities is trying to push back in this. There are very many people doing it within universities doing that work, but it's important to sort of recognize that there are pushes for this and that it sort of needs to sort of become bigger to challenge the dominance of certain sort of valuing certain forms of research, I guess. And as you can see here, even, you know, even the Hulk has been transformed by podcasting to having emotional intelligence. It's just amazing. I love it. A brave new world awaits you. So for many people, as both like the people that have presented have shared, for everyone else, it's terrifying. The idea of starting anything new is a completely terrifying idea, especially new technology, new all of this stuff. And it's terrifying because you're still learning or you haven't even started. Both Star-Lord and Dr. Evil understand these things. I mean, one of the best ways to start is honestly start listening to podcasts. And so if there are podcasts that you've listened to, or maybe like something that you're curious about, someone is probably already making a podcast about it. It's really like mind-blowing every time I search that I find someone who has a podcast about this thing, or they refer me to someone else, or like podcasts often kind of have their own sort of networking where they'll sort of, this podcast will refer to this podcast, that'll refer to this podcast, or people will guest sort of speak in one podcast and talk about theirs. So there's a lot out there to sort of get familiar with what this thing is. And there's endless, you know, there's endless possibilities, but you don't have to learn it all before you start. And I think Emily was sort of hinting towards that you don't have to like be an expert in the tech. You don't have to have like everything fully completely designed before you sort of jump into for yourself. And just keep that in mind. Like research, you still have to get your hands dirty and sort of like jump into it before, you know, in order to really make the most sense out of what you're doing. And, you know, sort of like the groups in terms of us when we're in this program, they really just threw you in, and in a group, you had to come up with an idea, come up with a concept, fumble with the tech, and then make it. And it didn't really matter how much experience you had before or during. It's really just about trying to kind of throw yourself in and learn as much as you can within, you know, some reasonable time period for yourself. And as grad students, that may be a very small time period in terms of the available time that we actually have, but doing as much as you can to try to get as familiar with what this thing is as possible. And I mean, and it's the way you can relate to it, there's a lot of ways that we can relate to it. One is that it is one way that you can sort of try to become the publicly an engaged scholar. So we have this idea of the public engaged scholar. Podcasting is a really interesting way of thinking about how to make our research accessible to communities that maybe normally wouldn't have had access to them before. That the university is itself an institution that kind of hoards knowledge. And so what what changes when we think of trying to communicate our research in new ways. But also there are podcasts where people just talk about their research in in the same way they would as if it was a conference. And so there is like a whole wide ranging opportunities for how you might think of this medium, because it's a medium. It's a form of communicating that we can either ignore, or if you're interested, take it in really interesting directions. It is scary to have an idea and want to put it out there. And I think like trying to make the connections between podcasting and research is actually really, really helpful. The same way you might pitch your research, your dissertation idea, you're sweating about it. You're all, is this going to be something accepted? But it's thinking about how to make ideas, your own ideas, happen. I mean, it's really about how, if you have an idea about maybe you're interested in cooking. Maybe this actually has nothing to do with research. Maybe you go on hikes. Maybe you love anime, or you're a Pokemon fan. Like what podcasting is helpful for is if you have something to share, or you think you have something to share, that you can create an episode and find an audience for it. Because there is someone out there who wants to listen to you talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about. And so that's in one direction. The other is that maybe you do want to contribute to a public dialogue or some wider debate. And this is another way of thinking about what are the issues in society that I want to engage? How might I just talk about this in a different way than I might write about it, or in a different way to a different kind of audience. And so it's interesting to think about it in that way. Just briefly, the last minute or two, there are different ways of approaching it. And so if you're going to be thinking about a podcast for yourself versus for a class, versus whether you're the instructor for the class and how to go about designing the class, you would obviously go about things very differently in terms of how you're preparing. If it's for yourself, definitely throw yourself in. The only way that you'll learn is to really do that. And if it's for a class, for example, where I would take a little bit more time than just throwing yourself in for the class, or putting it into your sort of your syllabus, because you don't just start a podcast for others in the same way that you might for yourself. And I think it's really important for instructors, because I've had many people come to me who are like, I want to like add podcasting into my syllabus, and then we're really, really rushed to think about it and what does this actually entail, and end up really, really burning out their students, because it's really a lot of work, or not actually building in the scaffolding for how do you actually get someone who maybe has no idea about what podcasting is, relating it to content, and how this actually relates to a method or a methodology that is related to the kind of content that you're learning. And that's important. Podcasting is its own art form. And if to do justice to the art form and best prepare students for doing this work, then we have to be a little bit thoughtful in trying to design courses and that sort of thing. So in Asian American studies, this was like right before the pandemic. So they were like a little ahead of the curve. We were trying to start a digital lab, so that had podcasting, that had sort of video tech. We could sort of provide editing for students. It came out of a class that me and another grad student had taught on Arab Asian media justice. And there was a lot of interest in sort of developing a lab. And so we have a podcasting studio where, it's been fun before the pandemic to like work with students who have projects, or their grad students were working in groups to sort of develop like a final project, and they had a podcast, and trying to help students think about what kind of storytelling do you want to do, how might you tie in your readings to this, and then how do we sort of make it happen. The designing the curriculum too, I mean, I also had experiences right as the pandemic happened, where faculty did were really committed to like incorporating podcasting in. And so I have had sort of that opportunity to help faculty try to do that work. But I think it's more important for the faculty that are interested in doing this to do it yourself, to take part in the trainings that the DHI is doing, at the NHC. They have a faculty institute. It's challenging for people to ask their students to do stuff that they've never done. And I think that's actually an important realization for like educators, for faculty, is that to really know what it takes to make a podcast, the best thing to do is to try to make it yourself. Then you can sort of help plan and foresee what some of the challenges might be. So really take that on yourself, and then sort of start to create the community, find the communities that are here on campus, the amazing lab that the DHI is making, to try to think about how might you incorporate this in. There are also faculty grants for like course design and that sort of thing. That I think it's really worth thinking about deeply and planning, because the students love this stuff, and they sort of, when they are best prepared to do it. And I think that's sort of our obligation as sort of creators, is to sort of be free to try to come up with our own thing. But then when it comes to working with students and designing this, we also want it to be an enjoyable learning experience. And that actually inspires them. And with that, I think I will stop my share. And if folks have questions, I think we have enough time, and I'm happy to answer anything. So thanks for having me again.
Thank you. That was wonderful and full of memes as promised. If anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just ask them here. Like, that would be great. It's a smaller group. I appreciate all of this insight, and I was kind of taking notes and trying to get a sense of these different experiences of being in the podcasting workshop, but also what I think is important, and I think, Beshara, you framed this well for us, is whenever something is kind of it's the zeitgeist of the podcast right now, right? And there's a lot of interest in thinking of like, should I make one? Someone referred me to a podcast recently, and I hear you. I'm also not a huge podcast listener, although I enjoy the ones people send to me. But I wondered if you could just, maybe the panelists could think for a minute about, is there something unique about what the podcast as a medium offers that you see as something kind of exceptional for this, and isn't just, which I guess I believe that it isn't just what's popular right now. I think there is something about its form that I would love to hear from you about. Why this medium? What is it that we can do here that we kind of can't do elsewhere as graduate students, I guess maybe as people within or adjacent to the academy. But what are your thoughts on maybe why podcasts as a medium? Is everyone being shy? Okay, Emily, there you go.
If no one else has any thoughts, I will say I'm not a huge podcast listener. I listen to like two. But one of the things I enjoy about it that I think maybe relates to the question of how we can make research like more accessible, or how we can make it more approachable or something, is that it's just sometimes just nice to hear people's voices. Like, I think you get a sense of like it being an actual person, and you get a real sense of like, oh, you can tell when people are excited about something. You can kind of get a sense of people's personalities in a way that allows you to maybe like, I don't know, enjoy the way that a certain person talks about something or whatever. that might not be as much in other mediums. In that sense, it sort of reminds me a little bit of like blogging, right? Which obviously you're not literally hearing someone's voice, but you get sort of used to their style and you get used to the sort of way that they write things. And so you get that sense of personal connection to whatever the subject is, in addition to learning whatever it is about the subject. So that's my take.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think you just put this in the chat, Stephanie, but yeah, I think it's like both an active and a passive activity, right? Like you can go for a walk, or like I've done things where like I've been on a road trip and like I'm listening to a podcast, like You're Wrong About, which I'm sure many of you have probably heard of. So like these things are really interesting, or like just anecdotally, like my partner listens to like podcasts like no other, and she's always like, oh, you know, like I learned this today, and she'll tell me like she'll report back what she learned. And so like it's a bunch of stuff that you can't really like get from, you know, you're not gonna be able to read all the books on all of these topics. So it's nice to be able to have a format where it can be conversational or like interview style, or you know, a number of different things, or like you know, sometimes I've listened to podcasts to like know what a book's argument's going to be because that author comes to talk about it, and that's kind of like shorthand for not having to read the book. I don't tell my exam advisors that, but these are things that I think, you know, give. I mean, for that, I think about it both in sort of like my own personal interests and then academic interests. You know.
Hi, I'm Marina. I actually helped founded Aggie's Near and Far, which is a podcast about global education at UC Davis. I work with undergraduate students. And one of the reasons why we originally had come up with the idea of doing a global education podcast was to talk to students about their experiences in, you know, global education, particularly study abroad or international students, you know, at UC Davis, and trying to, you know, one, get their experience and share their experience for others who might be interested, and then also for them to be able to process it. And I think that, you know, a lot of us process things through talking about them, and a podcast is a way to do that. So not only do you have a product at the end that is shareable, but I think something that I really like about it is that it actually serves a purpose in and of itself. And a lot of us do research where we interview people. And so we know that, you know, that the interviewing itself can lead to benefits for everyone involved, if you do it correctly, obviously. And in a compassionate and appropriate manner. But I think for me, that's what my experience has been, is that podcasting as a medium is special because it is talking. It is, you know, connecting with other people in the moment. And so, yeah, I like that.
Well, I'd like to say something. Thank you all so much for all of your contributions. I'm Kathy Wallerstein. I'm the Associate Director of the DHI, for those of you I haven't met. And yeah, as Stephanie said, we're really trying to sort of expand our podcasting opportunities and resources. And obviously this is a really important discussion to be having. And I was really struck by, I know very little about podcasting. In fact, I listen to very few podcasts, almost accidentally when I do. Very struck by the collaborative nature of everything that everybody's talking about, and also the intimate nature of the podcast and the intimate nature of the voice, and the way in which it just, it's a medium that really invites a different type of connection with the material. And I would love to hear some more about your ideas on how to use podcasts in the classroom, maybe as a way of inviting students into a kind of co-creation with their research materials. And I'm also, I mean, there isn't that much time, but I'm also curious, Daniel, to hear more about ways in which you have thought about applying these questions in podcasts to K through 12 education, because you mentioned that you're involved with that. And have you done anything with that, or what ideas you have? So just throwing that open.
I mean, I can just sort of I have a couple ideas. One is to think of a podcast. If a student was going to analyze, let's say, a novel, there's a certain type of structure for how the teacher would go about sort of getting the student to think about how to read this novel. Maybe what theories might you use, but also how to approach this thing. What does this thing actually consist of? How is it made? What is it about this thing that makes you feel in a certain way? And so part of, I think, deconstructing the podcast itself is actually really, really important for students as a medium. One, to find one that they're interested in or that they maybe they listen to, maybe maybe they haven't listened to any, and so maybe just offering different like podcasts for them to sort of get exposed to. And then to think about, yeah, what about the music? What about the timing of these things? What about this story or this person makes you interested in this story? So I think part of it is to go back to Stephanie's question, it's that there's a different kind of storytelling that happens, and across different podcasts, it's very different. And so trying to figure out what it is about maybe a particular genre of podcasting that makes this thing something that like you want to listen to this in your car on your way to class. I think is really important that we don't just sort of accept that it's just like the ubiquitousness of it, but that there is actually something special about certain kinds of podcasts that really connect to people. In some ways, it's almost like you're invited into a fireside chat, that someone is sharing, like you were saying, a very intimate story about their life, about why something is important to them, why a researcher is actually doing a particular kind of research. That actually makes you a lot more interested in that thing than you would have if you just had their book. And so I think like just starting out in terms of thinking about it of a kind of critical literacy of podcasting helps to then like introduce the kind of, okay, well, what are the kinds of stories might you want to tell? Or if there's a certain kind of content in this class, how might you explain this to your grandma? And you would go about explaining it very, very differently than you would probably your instructor. And that actually forces you to have to make sense of the material in a way that you didn't before. And I think that kind of like prodding that allows a little bit more creativity is really, really important. So that we're not just trying to reproduce, having them take a test on a podcast. If we're going to introduce it, then what our expectations are for learning also have to change, and how we measure that. And I think that's just something to keep in mind.
And then really quick, if I can just respond to Kathy's, because I know Joshua just put up their hand. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is ways to kind of create. So like here at the History Project, I helped put together a brochure, I guess we can call it, about the California recall right ahead of the election. And that would be a great example of where we could use a podcast, right? And kind of take these big ideas, because naturally, like we went into a lot of depth into like on that like packet. But, you know, we could have a podcast where, like, for example, I could talk about the 2003 recall and like what it means for today. But the way that I'm going to talk is going to be very different than it would be written, or that even it would be used in the classroom. And then obviously we can think about things like kind of like what Beshara was just saying about how like you want to like think about how you're talking. You're not going to talk like an academic when you're on the podcasting forum. So I think it's an opportunity to sort of think about how you can not necessarily, you know, I don't like to use the term dumb down, but like make it accessible for broad audiences. Or like, for example, like when I had originally written the recall thing with my colleagues, we were thinking about 11th and 12th graders, but then we got an email that a 5th grade class was using it. So I think we can sort of think about these different opportunities. And so it may not, like, we want to be intentional about using something like a podcast, but like there are a lot of different ways where it can sort of move outside of what we had anticipated or expected.
Yeah, Joshua, you have a question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Is my microphone working? Can you hear me okay? Great. First of all, thanks everyone, both for making the effort to engage that program, and then for presenting it to us today. I appreciate that. It seems to me that one of the really interesting things is that we're in this moment where the world of podcasts is still a little bit of an anything goes open frontier scenario, right? Where you can have an incredibly slickly produced, multi-people, multi-track sound effects, carefully, tightly made. And you can have like two people talking smack for a while and recording themselves, just like dumping, and they're like, this is our podcast. And they're both those things are true, right? Those are both podcasts. And that's exciting. And it gives a lot of room to move. And people talked about the really different interests they had, not just in the content, like their subject of interest, but in the form and how it might circulate and who it engaged. I wonder if people see like a future wherein the category of podcast becomes much more formalized, where you get to the point, I'm thinking about the history of TV shows, right? Where it's not clear people knew what a TV show was in 1951, but a moment comes when you're like, there's a sitcom, it's 26 minutes long, it has, right? And then there's a dramedy, it's 46 minutes long and becomes very formalized. And I'm wondering if you think that moment is coming, and if that's going to make podcasts like better, worse, how you think about your own interest in relation to that trajectory. This is sort of a speculative question, but whatever, media archive, yada, yada, yada. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, I actually have a comment on that. I know I'm not on the panel, I'm finished. But when I was putting together a syllabus for a podcasting course for undergraduate students. And so I read a lot of kind of like the podcasting guides that were made actually kind of like in the early aughts when podcasting was like, you had to like upload your file to like, you know, whatever server. And it was like all very, very technical. And so like a lot of the guides were geared towards that. But even in those guides, all of the ones that I saw had like sections on what kind of podcast do you have? And there was like the sports podcast and the talk radio podcast and kind of all of these. And I think that really podcasting has kind of evaded those sorts of categories, and that, you know, there are genres, but that a lot of the podcasts that we enjoy aren't necessarily in one of like a single genre. And I think that there are styles that cross across different interests as well. So it is interesting to see kind of like how it was envisioned when it first began, and then also how it's evolving and how accessible it really has become, because now anyone can, you know, upload to SoundCloud or whatever they want and make their audio accessible.
Just to sort of one quick thought I have, I think I think it's turning out more like YouTube, where there are like YouTube content creators that people follow who, like, once you find that content creator, they tend to sort of they tend to stick with them, and so then they'll sort of even like gaming. I mean, even my nephew, you know, is obsessed with Minecraft and all of this stuff, and he'll just watch like people talk about themselves playing games for hours and hours and hours. It's obscene, but it's like, but he loves it. And I think that's how it seems to be playing. But there's also a scramble. There's an industry scramble that is also like, it's important to keep in mind in terms of like big radio companies, in terms of larger sort of corporations trying to monopolize it. So like what programs get aired, get shared, get aired sort of like within these networks is also very corporatized. But it's still not monopolized completely yet. I think there's still a lot of free play. They don't know how to capture such a largely growing audience and sort of content makers and all of this. Partly because there's so many distributors for, you know, you can on SoundCloud, on iTunes, on some of these also hubs that distribute podcasts in a lot of different places. That make it a little still accessible for people to make something that can, you know, have a wider audience. But I think there is pressure. There definitely is pressure, but that's what's nice about it, is that it doesn't have to be the most like perfectly structured thing. Podcast, even a raw sounding podcast can be great as long as it's an interesting story for people to hear. And that's what I think is exciting about it.
Thank you, everyone. I feel like we could continue to have this conversation, but in the interest of time, have to close it off. That was a really generative question. Thank you, actually, to everyone who asked questions and people who kind of provided some context. It's clear that podcasting is something we can talk more about in the humanities around its role for ourselves as researchers, as storytellers, also the role that the university would play in the dissemination of knowledge and making things accessible, as well as our own role in what looks like a kind of corporate consolidation that's on the horizon, perhaps around podcasting, but who knows? I'm glad we're in an open moment where kind of anything goes, because I think that, like you all have said, it makes it easy to just begin, to just get started, and the stakes can be low. And maybe as grad students, we can let down those perfectionist tendencies and just go into it, hopefully with others, as you've all mentioned, and make something that's nice to listen to. So thanks to everyone for sharing your experiences. I really appreciate that. And I know our larger community does. This video will be on YouTube for them to watch. And we hope that people who are interested will return on February 22nd to the DHI in Voorhees Hall, where we will be working with some equipment, talking about how to get started, and maybe exploring some of these questions in more depth as people start their own podcasts. So I'm going to stop recording now and say thank you once again.